notification came through at 11:37 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was still in the driveway of my parents' house, engine running, hands gripping the wheel because I hadn't been able to make myself drive away yet. It was a text from my bank, a transfer alert, $47,000, my entire down payment fund, every cent I'd saved over 4 years of double shifts and skipped vacations and eating instant noodles in a studio apartment in Burnaby. Gone. Transferred out in 3 separate transactions over the past 6 hours while I'd been inside eating my mother's pot roast and pretending everything was fine. I sat in that driveway for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, engine running, heat on, and I thought about all the things I'd been too careful not to think about for the past 2 days. Then I went back inside. My brother was still at the kitchen table. He had a beer in his hand and a look on his face like he'd been waiting. Not worried. Waiting. There's a difference, and I knew the difference the second I walked through the door. I showed him my phone screen. I didn't say anything. I just held it up. He looked at it for about 3 seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said, "You'll be fine, Sloane. You always land on your feet." That was it. 4 years of my life, and that was it. My name is Sloane Mercer. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Vancouver. My job, literally, is to find the money people try to hide. I audit financial records for fraud cases, trace asset transfers, reconstruct paper trails that other people try to destroy. I have a professional designation, a good salary, and until 11:47 on that Tuesday night, I had $47,000 sitting in a high-interest savings account at RBC, earmarked for the down payment on a condo I'd been pre-approved for in New Westminster. I tell you what I do for a living because it matters. It matters to what happened, and it matters to what I did about it. But I should start earlier than that Tuesday. I should start with the weekend, with the reason I was at my parents' house in the first place, sitting in that kitchen eating pot roast and pretending everything was fine. My parents live in Chilliwack, about an hour and a half east of Vancouver, in a house they've owned for 26 years. My brother, I'll call him by the name he goes by, which is just Dex, short for Dexter, still lives at home. He's 34. He's done a lot of things over the years, started a landscaping business that went under, enrolled in an electrician apprenticeship he dropped out of after 3 months, got into day trading during the pandemic, and lost money he borrowed from our parents. He's charming when he wants to be. He's always had a way of making things sound more certain than they are. My parents love him. That's not a criticism, just a fact. They love us both, but they worry about him in a way that's taken up most of the air in our family for as long as I can remember. I learned early to be the one who didn't need worrying about. I was the one who got good grades, got a scholarship, moved to Vancouver, built a career. I was the one who called every Sunday and visited on long weekends and didn't ask for anything. Looking back, I think I believe that if I was independent enough for long enough, eventually it would mean something, that it would translate into some kind of trust or respect, that eventually my brother would be expected to be the same. I was wrong about that. The reason I was home that weekend was my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. My mother had planned a small celebration, just family, just dinner at the house, nothing formal. She'd been talking about it for weeks. I drove out Friday evening after work, planning to stay through Sunday. Dex was already home, of course. He'd been home for the past 8 months after the day trading losses made his rent situation complicated. He seemed good that weekend, better than I'd seen him in a while. Relaxed. He helped set up the table for dinner, made my dad laugh a couple of times, asked me questions about work that seemed genuinely curious rather than performative. On Saturday, while my parents were out picking up a few things for the anniversary dinner, Dex asked if he could borrow my laptop to print something. His printer was broken, he said, and he needed to print a form for something related to employment insurance. I said sure. It was in my bag in the guest room. The password was the same as always. That was my mistake. Not the only one I made that weekend, but the one that started everything. I'd had the same laptop password since 2019. Dex knew it because I'd given it to him once before, 2 years earlier, when he needed to do something online at Christmas and his phone had died. I hadn't thought to change it. Why would I? He's my brother. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to know at the time, was that he didn't just print his EI form. He also opened my browser, found my saved passwords, and used them to access my online banking. I had autofill enabled. My RBC credentials were saved. He logged in, looked at my accounts, and then he waited. He waited until Sunday afternoon, when my parents and I were in the backyard having cake and my phone was inside on the counter charging. He transferred the money in 3 transactions, 15,000, 17,000, 15,000. Spread out enough to avoid an automatic fraud flag, but not spread out enough that it mattered, because he did them all within 40 minutes of each other. He sent the money to an account I later found out belonged to someone he owed money to, a private lender, someone outside the banking system, the kind of situation you get into when you burn through your legitimate credit options. He used my savings to pay off a debt he'd hidden from everyone, and then he came outside and had cake with us. I think about that sometimes. The cake. My mother had ordered it from a bakery in Chilliwack, lemon and raspberry, her favorite. We stood in the backyard and sang into pictures, and the whole time Dex knew. He stood there with frosting on his fork, and he knew. I didn't check my account until that night when I was leaving. I don't check it constantly. I'm not anxious about money the way some people are, because I know exactly how much I have and where it is. I checked because I'd been thinking about scheduling the transfer to my lawyer's trust account for the condo purchase, and I wanted to confirm the balance before I went to sleep. That's when the notification came through. When I walked back into the house and showed Dex the screen, I was calmer than I've ever been in my life. That kind of calm that comes from shock, but also, and I think this is important, from the part of me that had spent years professionally untangling financial deception. Some part of my brain had already shifted into work mode, already started cataloging. He said, "You'll be fine, you always land on your feet," and I nodded slowly and said, "Okay, can you tell me where the money went?" He looked at me for a second. Something moved across his face. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or calculation or both. "I needed it," he said. "I was going to pay you back. I'm getting money in the next couple weeks. I just needed to cover something urgent." "What was urgent?" He shook his head. "It's complicated. You don't need the whole story." I looked at him for a long time, and then I said, "Okay, again." And I said goodnight to my parents, and I drove back to Vancouver. I didn't tell my parents that night. I didn't tell anyone. I drove home in the dark and I made a list. The next morning, I called RBC as soon as they opened. I reported the transfers as unauthorized. My login credentials had been accessed without my permission. Technically true, because I'd given him access to the laptop for a specific purpose, not to access my banking. The bank flagged the transactions, opened an investigation, and issued a temporary account freeze. Then I called a lawyer. Her name is not important, but she's very good, and she specializes in civil fraud. I've referred clients to her firm before through my work. I explained the situation in as much detail as I had. She asked me a few questions and then she said, "Do you have any evidence beyond the transaction records?" I told her I'd get it. This is the part where my job becomes relevant again. Because I know how financial trails work. I know what can be recovered, what can be subpoenaed, what looks innocent until you put it beside something else. I spent the next 4 days reconstructing everything I could find. The bank's own records showed the transfers came from an IP address registered to my parents' home network. Not my phone, not any device I'd used. That alone was significant. I requested records of the recipient account through the legal process my lawyer initiated, and we found that it belonged to a numbered company which after a bit of digging was registered to a private lender who'd had previous civil judgments against him in BC. Dex had borrowed $28,000 from this person 6 months earlier. There were texts obtained properly through the legal process, not by me going through his phone, between Dex and the lender that referenced the debt and the arrangement Dex had made to repay it. One of the texts, sent the Thursday before the anniversary weekend, read, "Need it settled by end of month or it gets complicated." Dex had replied, "Don't worry, I've got it handled." He'd gone home that weekend knowing he was going to take my money. I thought a lot about whether he came home for the anniversary dinner because he genuinely wanted to celebrate our parents, or because it was the best opportunity to access my laptop. I don't know the answer. I don't think it's one or the other, actually. I think he can hold both things at the same time, love his parents and steal from his sister. And that's the part that took me the longest to come to terms with. That it's not that he doesn't care. It's that his caring has a hierarchy, and I'm below his survival instinct. I found out something else during those 4 days. This wasn't the first time. When I was 24, the year I moved to Vancouver, I'd had about $800 go missing from a joint account. I still shared with my parents. It was a holdover from when I was a student, and I'd been meaning to close it for months. I assumed at the time it was a bank error, and then I assumed I'd miscounted, and then I just absorbed the loss and forgot about it. because I was starting a new job and the timing was chaotic. When I pulled the records now, 7 years later, as part of what I was building with my lawyer, I found the transfer. Same pattern, same timing. He'd been home that week. I'd been home briefly. There'd been access to shared information. Same structure, taken in pieces, sent to another account. $800. I'd been 24 and I'd let it go. He'd known for 7 years that I'd let it go. I want to tell you about the conversation with my parents because it was the hardest thing I've done in my adult life, and I don't think I'll ever fully stop thinking about it. I drove back to Chilliwack on the following Saturday. I told my parents I needed to talk to them about something, and I sat them down at the kitchen table. The same table, the anniversary cake box still on the counter waiting to be recycled, and I told them everything. My mother went very still. She has this way of going still when things are very bad, like her body is conserving resources. She didn't interrupt me. She just listened. My father started shaking his head partway through and didn't stop. He said, "Sloane," like a question that didn't have a follow-up. Dex wasn't home. He'd gone out that morning, which I'd confirmed with my mother before driving there. I didn't want him in the room. When I finished, my mother looked at her hands. My father said he was sure there was an explanation, and I said I know it feels that way, but I want to show you the evidence. I pulled out my laptop and walked them through the IP records, the transfer timestamps, the recipient account, the text messages. My father stopped saying there must be an explanation around the third page. My mother didn't say much. She asked once whether I was sure. I said yes. She asked whether I had a lawyer. I said yes. She said, "What are you going to do?" I told her. She didn't try to talk me out of it. I want to say that clearly. She didn't try to talk me out of it. My father asked if there was another way, and I said I was open to a repayment agreement if Dex came to the table immediately with a clear plan, and the lawyer had agreed to give a 2-week window. But I wasn't going to quietly absorb $47,000 and let it be a family secret. That wasn't on the table. My mother nodded. She said, "That's fair." She looked about 10 years older than she had at the anniversary dinner. I hated that. I still hate it. What my brother did didn't just take my money. It took something from my parents too, some version of how they understood their family, and I've never stopped being angry at him for that part. Dex didn't come to the table with a plan. He called me the day after I spoke to our parents. He was defensive at first, started the call with, "I can't believe you went to mom and dad with this," as if the problem was my disclosure and not his theft. I told him I'd be happy to explain my timeline, but I needed him to understand that the civil process was moving forward regardless of whether he cooperated, and cooperation would result in a significantly better outcome for him. He went quiet. Then he said, "I didn't think you'd actually do anything about it." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I know." He was right in a way. I hadn't done anything about the $800 7 years ago. I hadn't done anything about the pattern I'd ignored for years. The loans that never got repaid, the subtle ways my parents' finances had been drawn into his instability, the way I'd trained myself not to look too closely, because looking closely meant having to act, and acting meant conflict, and conflict meant I was the problem. I'd spent my whole career following financial trails for strangers. I'd never once turned that skill on my own life. The legal process took 4 months from start to finish. RBC ultimately reversed 2 of the 3 transfers after their internal fraud investigation. The third required the civil proceeding to resolve, because it had already been disbursed by the recipient account before the freeze. My lawyer filed in BC Supreme Court. It was not inexpensive and it was not pleasant, but we had an overwhelming paper trail, and Dex didn't contest the core facts. He couldn't, because the facts were not ambiguous. The judgment required him to repay me the full $47,000 plus my legal costs on a structured schedule. There was also a condition related to a criminal referral. The RCMP was notified, and there's a separate process underway that I'm not going to get into detail about because it's still ongoing. What I'll say is that unauthorized access to someone's banking credentials and transferring their funds is fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada, and it doesn't matter that we're siblings. My parents ended up taking out a small line of credit to help Dex make the first payment. I didn't ask them to do that, and I told them not to. They did it anyway. I understand why, not because they thought what he did was acceptable, but because they couldn't bear watching the alternative. I've had to accept that this is how they love him and that it's not my choice to make. But the money started coming back. The condo purchase was delayed by 6 months. I lost the original unit I'd been pre-approved for. The deal fell through because of the timeline shift. I found another one. It closed in March. I have a place with a view of the Fraser River and a parking spot and an intercom that makes a very satisfying click when I buzz myself in. I own it. Just me. No one else's name on anything. A lot of people, when something like this happens, talk about whether they've forgiven the person. I've been asked that question a few times. By a friend, by my therapist, once by my mother in a roundabout way that I don't think she realized was asking it. I don't have a clean answer. Forgiveness is a word that gets used, like it's one thing, one switch you flip, and on the other side of it, everything is settled. In my experience, it's more like a process that doesn't have a definite end state. I'm not consumed by anger. I don't spend my days thinking about my brother. But I also don't call him. And the last time I saw him was at Christmas in my parents' kitchen, and I sat on one side of the room and he sat on the other, and we were both very polite, and it felt like sitting in a waiting room with someone you'll never actually speak to. Maybe that's forgiveness. Maybe it's just adaptation. I'm genuinely not sure. What I know is this. I spent a long time believing that being self-sufficient was a kind of armor, that if I needed nothing from anyone, nothing could be taken from me. I was wrong. You can be self-sufficient and still have things taken. The armor doesn't work that way. What actually protected me, in the end, was being willing to look at what was true, to not look away, to treat myself with the same seriousness I'd always given to clients I'd never met, to say this matters, the record matters, the evidence matters, and I deserve the same rigor I'd give any stranger in trouble. My mother asked me once, during those 4 months, if I thought I'd done the right thing. It wasn't an accusatory question, she was genuinely asking. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and she looked at me the way she used to look at me when I was small, and she was trying to figure out what I needed. I said yes. She said, I think so too. She looked out the window for a second. Then she said, I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner. I told her she didn't have to apologize, but it meant something to me that she said it. It meant something that she didn't ask me to soften the edges of what had happened or absorb it quietly for the sake of keeping things smooth. It meant something that she said, I think so too. If you're in something like this, if you're sitting in a driveway right now, with a notification on your phone and a sick feeling in your stomach, and the person who did it is someone you love and someone who is supposed to love you back, I want you to know that you are allowed to take it seriously. You are allowed to document everything and call a lawyer and refuse to let it become a secret. The fact that it happened inside a family doesn't make it less of a thing. It doesn't make you the difficult one for refusing to let it disappear. Your savings account is not a family resource. Your credit is not a family resource. Your trust is not a thing someone gets to help themselves to and expect you to quietly replace. I own my apartment now. The down payment is in the walls, in the floors, in the window that looks out at the river on mornings when the fog sits low and the city is quiet, and the only name on the deed is mine. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually.